Now, before we move on to our next panel discussion on supply chain standards, or if I may, value chain standards, but this is a point we'll get back to shortly, I am delighted to introduce IAB Europe's chief economist, a young man you I think all very well acquainted with by now, Dr. Daniel Knapp, for a short presentation. And just to say, by means of an introduction, that data from SSPs is indeed a crucial tool for publishers to succeed in programmatic, from understanding advertiser and agency demand and spend patterns, to managing inventory, setting prices, obtaining information for vendor QBRs and client briefings, and also as a source of intelligence for AdOps and Sales, and as the foundation for ongoing perpetual optimization. Now, as digital advertising switches towards what we generically refer to as a cookieless world, these insights that can guide a monetization strategy are as crucial as ever, if not more. So, Daniel, over to you. We are very eager to hear your ideas on how we can all move forward towards a sustainable programmatic value chain for all. We're all ears. The screen is yours.
Thank you, Konstantin, and you have already succinctly summarized the essence of the short presentation that I would like to give to you. You all know that the programmatic supply chain is complex, and that transparency, whatever that means, and it means many different things to many different people, has been a topic very high on the public agenda for the last couple of years. We had the kind of seminal ISBA PwC report come out just a little bit more than a year ago. And I think things have fallen a bit quiet on the transparency topic for a couple of months due to COVID, but it's coming back with a vengeance. And as we are seeing continued growth now in digital advertising in 2020 and 2021, we realize that 2021, it's the last year of growth in the old paradigm, the last year of growth before the deprecation of third-party cookies, and also the last year of growth before new sets of regulations come into place. So this industry conference here is called, it's about forging a new or digital New Deal. And a digital New Deal also includes pretty meaty technical aspects. It is about how can the programmatic supply chain can be converted from supply to a value chain, meaning how can it work for all, for publishers, for advertisers, for intermediaries, and for consumers. There's a lot of work going on in this area, a lot of fragmented work. And what I would like to do in this brief presentation is kind of sketch out the contours of this debate and provide some thinking points for the panel on how, as an industry, in particular within the collective forum of IAB Europe, we can take this discussion forward and ensure that all constituents can thrive sustainably. 2 days ago, we published our AdX benchmark report. And this AdX benchmark report tracks ad spend across Europe. Something remarkable came out of this report. And that is digital advertising overall grew by plus 6.3%. Most of the growth came from walled gardens. The open internet didn't grow as much. But if we zoom into the bit that is the open internet, display, video, and also a little bit of audio, we can see that programmatic advertising is the key driver of this. In Europe, in 2020, 7.9 billion euros were spent, and that is just on the SSP level, on programmatic advertising. And that is now more than on non-programmatic advertising, IO-based and so forth. We also saw that programmatic really benefited from the economic rebound due to the switch on, switch off nature of programmatic. So it's useful for advertisers, it's a key source of income for publishers, and it really is the foundation for the open internet. But how can we ensure that this growth really continues, that this marketplace is going to thrive? This is more important than ever, Because if we look at how the overall non-search, non-classified landscape looks like, we can see the open internet is really contextualized within many, many very, very large walled gardens. Programmatic, in contrast to these walled gardens, has grown in a decentralized manner. In a sense, it was a grassroots movement in the beginning of many different companies and vendors having ideas and building on existing tools and infrastructures and standards, third-party cookies and so forth, and building their own. But the beauty of the democratic nature of programmatic, everybody could build something, everyone could access supply and demand, also meant that there was a severe degree of fragmentation. Not just fragmentation of vendors, we all know the Lumascape, but also fragmentation of reporting, of measurement, and so forth. So the key question, if we look at the future of the digital advertising world, is how can the democratic nature, how can the benefits of openness of programmatic be preserved while reducing the likelihood for fragmented truths? So how can programmatic advertising be not just many different small things, but be one coherent ecosystem that can provide sustainable alternatives to the walled gardens? And also, how can it be sustainable monetization for publishers who are, if you look at disinformation, if you look at audience changes and so forth, who are increasingly under siege and are wondering, is the advertising funding model overall still viable? So big questions that programmatic has to solve. And because it is now a mature industry, a 7.9 billion industry, these questions must be at the forefront of future industry development. Transparency that we talk about has a long history before programmatic. Let me briefly contextualize this journey, and we're going to end up here with the ANA, the American Association, on the right, not because it's the end point, but because we're currently coming full circle in the discussion. For everybody to be sure, transparency isn't a topic in media that has been called for with the rise of programmatic. It has always been endemic in particular agency, advertiser, publisher relationships, even in the old world of traditional media. To give you an example, there was a seminal presentation in the ANA by John Mandel, former Mediacom CEO, who was talking about kickbacks in the agency world. And these the word has a negative connotation in the US, but doesn't really have elsewhere, because it's a firm part of established and proper business practice. So just this interpretation of the word sparked some concerns, and actually what happened on the basis of this was an investigation into how does the advertising, not programmatic, but the advertising value chain overall look like? What do advertisers know about where their money goes? What do they know about contracts and so forth? Advertising, or programmatic advertising, was just a tiny little fragment of all of this. Just one paragraph or a few pages were dedicated to it. But this study set foundations for other bodies, particularly regulatory bodies, to look at this topic. For instance, the Bavarian media regulator in Germany. We saw then, as we progressed, a lot of focus on ensuring or enhancing transparency, and that was mainly auditing or financial transparency, and there was an entire cottage industry that sparked around it. But it didn't work so well, because there was a big gap between the talk of transparency and the actual desire to pay for the analysis of transparency, and some key vendors closed their doors because the talked about market wasn't the market that people were opening up their wallets for. We saw then, of course, the ISPA PwC study, which has kept lots of media attention for an end-to-end view of the programmatic value chain. There was the often shortened discussion about the unknown delta of 15%, which, if we go into more detail, can be solved and isn't all that scary. It's just about the limitations of being able to match data because it's so fragmented. So if the industry really works together to provide more standards and abilities to match data, a lot of these questions go away. We saw also an extension of the topic of transparency towards more of the antitrust perspective. If we look at the Competition and Markets Authority in the UK, and also we could see, for instance, the ANA come in again with the new investigations in 2021. Going back, what you can see is all these different studies and the conversation, they extended over time the topic of transparency. We moved from audit to contracts to what's the business model of advertising and programmatic? How can we ensure that transparency maximizes media value? Is there fraud in programmatic? How can we use transparency to optimize supply chains to ensure that media outcomes convert into business outcomes? Is there a competition perspective, independent versus aggregated and walled gardens? And also, with the rise of disinformation, what role does programmatic play, or can programmatic play, in combating this through the rich and highly textured data that it has available? The problem with all of these different questions, which are all very valuable in their own right, is which one to focus on. And we have many really important industry initiatives, but a key concern is, what are they talking about? What do they want to talk about when they speak about transparency? Many initiatives stall with long discussions and little output because they can't really agree which of these topics to address, all of them or one of them. What is transparency and what is the main value of transparency for everybody? Increasingly, we can also see regulators looking at the digital advertising supply chain. Well, they're not calling out programmatic specifically. It is pretty clear from the text what they mean. So here's a screenshot of a regulatory proposal for the Digital Markets Act that is currently being discussed and reviewed at the EU level. And there is, if you read the fine print in Article 42, a very interesting remark about transparency obligations. They talk about gatekeepers. That's a very technical term that doesn't really apply to the gatekeeper definition in our industry. But the important thing is that the supply of ad services should contain information on both sides, advertiser and publisher, to understand the price paid as part of the relevant value chain. This isn't fully fleshed out yet, but it shows that understanding what budget flows are is important for the regulator. Why is it important for the regulator? Number one, a clear focus on the sustainability of media, big concerns about media pluralism. How can publishers continue to be funded? But secondly, there's a broader thing, and this is a massive opportunity for us as the digital ad industry. The broader thing is we're seeing across industries. It could be logistics, it could be advertising, it could be travel. We're seeing more and more complex supply chains emerging. And often these supply chains are data-driven or even algorithmic, with places making algorithmic decisions, etc. And this places a key concern for the regulator, because they need to realize, how can we as policymakers with comparably little expertise in data and the complexities of the markets we're supposed to regulate, how can we acquire knowledge about this? And this is a huge opportunity, as I said, for the digital ad industry, because the ad industry, as we know, with privacy discussions, was on a defensive stance. If we go ahead and say, we are going to increase transparency and we are going to show regulators how it works, how transparency can be created in data-driven, in algorithmic markets, we can become a cheerleader for, or kind of a template industry for the broader algorithmization of the economy. And a lot of learnings, positive learnings, can be taken from advertising to other industries from the regulator. But despite all of these kind of trends, complexity remains a massive feature of the supply chain. So here you can see one publisher and different advertisers. We took the ones from the ISPA PwC study and others which are very focused or vocal on supply chain to look at how many paths they have. There are many. There are hundreds of paths, and depending on how many brands you have, it can easily be thousands. For instance, if you look at one car manufacturer, how many supply paths they have, including the car dealerships. If you visualize this, from left is the advertiser and right is the publisher, it looks like a piece of abstract art. Maybe we could do an NFT out of this. And you can see, if you zoom in, how many different vendors are really involved in here. Is this sustainable? Which path is the best? Are they all transparent? Is reporting data attached to all of those? Huge questions. Typically, we can see every advertiser and publisher has a fingerprint on how these things work. But understanding how these change, which paths are important, which are less important, is very, very hard to do. And the interesting thing is that many paths of the top advertisers for publishers, they remain constant over time. But the bottom 50% of ad spend, which publishers can't really ignore, they involve a lot more complexity about management and insight. How can it be made easier for publishers to manage and understand this and kind of work with those advertisers to develop more strategic relationships? There is now a wide array of association-led and also commercial initiatives focusing on various instances of transparency. Yesterday, an email came in from Prebit, which is something very remarkable. It said that now there should be a placeholder into the different adapters to include advertiser domains, which is what wasn't the case before, which again means better understanding on who's the advertiser and who is the brand and passing this on systematically throughout the bid stream. We can see agencies, and here's just one example of OMG, but all of the holding groups are doing this, looking at existing standards, such as JSON, supply chain object, to provide more transparency. So transparency is becoming a service requirement. We at IB Europe did a regularly updated guide on transparency. We can see commercial initiatives like Seller's Guide, which is now open for everybody. Again, we can plug in your ads.txt and see what are direct relationships, what are reseller relationships, and provide, in a sense, analytics on top of existing industry standards, something very encouraging. And we're also seeing, this one is driven by IAB France and the French Advertiser Association, a new initiative to codify more systematically on how information about an advertiser, a brand, and a specific campaign is being passed through the programmatic supply chain so that campaigns can be matched end to end. Because there's often a huge question about a publisher can't see how much spend is coming from a given advertiser. The agency spends a certain amount with a publisher, but both can't reconcile how much money really arrived. Not because it went missing, but just because the data doesn't really match up. Increasingly, we can see the bug moving towards a feature. So the lack of transparency becoming a feature to help optimize the chain. So there are kind of collaborations between Group M here, Index, Spotex, and Programmatic, but increasingly, the topic of SPO has become big. The question is, what is it really? And while many are working on it, there's a lack of common definitions, and it's often incredibly manual. So lots more work to be done. To do all of this, a reliable and standardized mapping, so matching all the different entities, is a crucial starting point. DSPs and SSPs often have amazing and very detailed UIs and APIs on how to analyze spend. But it's all been built, as I said before, in a decentralized ecosystem in isolation. So we need a single source of truth, an integration platform to bring all of this together to allow buyers and sellers to match things, and also for SSPs and DSPs to understand where they're good, where they can enhance their performance together with their partners. And working on this together is a key area for IB Europe to invest in. Often, though, I think programmatic supply chain topics are only looking at the data, and they're not looking at the decisioning logics behind things. This is another topic which also regulators are looking at. An example is here. So if we take a given publisher and you look at demand and supply, if you take, for instance, fill rate and CPM as proxies for demand and supply, you would expect a correlation between the two. But in this case here, if you rank if you rank the day on the hour with the highest fill rate and then decreasing, you actually see no correlation at all with CPM. Is this right? Or does it mean that there's a decisioning logic somewhere in programmatic as interaction effect somehow between vendors that mean that the publisher, or maybe even the SSP or the DSP, not a single entity is in control of the marketplace, but something is happening in the interaction between all of them. The topic is changing increasingly. Programmatic has been open, and here you can see after the foundation of the GDR, of course, there was this famous sentence, nobody is intending to build a wall, but this democratic notion of programmatic is increasingly going away as we're moving towards more of a Splinternet with more direct integrations, so-called hedged gardens, with agencies building direct SSP integrations. If you see Walmart Connect making preferred partner choices, and also, for instance, Disney and others in particular, if we move into CTV, much shorter supply chains with different partners. So this is different questions about transparency, more about not who is involved in the auction, but how do different supply chains to different pieces of inventory, how do they compare? Lastly, the new world of addressability, I think, really changes the transparency debate. And increasingly, we're going to see it connected to broader topics of optimization. So different demands of transparency, or questions to be addressed based on, do you have logged in users, do you use context, and so forth. And also, how does, for instance, the supply chain and the value that's being created, how does that link to media outcomes? These are typically two entirely different discussions right now. But I believe that transparency and supply path optimization at one point will be just one other component of overall media optimization. And this is why I think we're moving from a supply chain to a value chain. And there are 4 principles that we've identified that make this possible. First, there are more and more controls. We already got standards. There are new things coming out there, for instance, with Trust ID. We see a move away from the fee obsession to an outcome obsession, because not all additional fees are bad. A longer chain isn't necessarily worse than a shorter chain, because it is about the outcomes that can be delivered. If an intermediary is adding value, increased attribution, increased targeting, increased retention, increased media value, this is all important. This is increasingly fueled by in-housing as well. Increasingly, as I mentioned, we need to orchestrate this Splinternet. So the rise of one-to-few or one-to-one supply chains creates entirely new questions on how to orchestrate the silos, which would be a new transparency question. And lastly, as we know about these interaction effects, for instance, and about SPO being so manual, we need to shift to a more experimental and data and evidence-driven approach to ensure that transparency is really there. Focus on marketplace economics, for instance, and so forth. And these, I think, are some of the main topics that need to be discussed in order to make the supply chain into a value chain and workable for all. And with that, I would like to pass back to Constantine. I look very much forward to the panel. Thank you.